welcome to this explainer. Today we're diving into how a series of unbelievable cause and effect dominoes transformed a few scattered colonies into a massive global powerhouse. We're tracing the journey of the United States. It's this truly epic story of ambition, intense conflict, and a constant ongoing struggle to figure out what freedom actually means. We've got a lot of ground to cover, so we're breaking down this 400-year timeline into 6 main eras. The New World collides, the road to independence, forging a new nation, manifest destiny and expansion, a house divided, and finally, the limits of reconstruction. Let's kick things right off with Section 1, the New World collides. You know, it's absolutely crucial to remember that our story doesn't start with an empty continent. It begins with a massive collision between established Native American societies, who had governed these lands for thousands of years, and highly ambitious European empires. Once Columbus arrived in 1492, colonization escalated incredibly fast. By 1607, the English managed to keep Jamestown from collapsing, mostly thanks to military-style leadership and a whole lot of help from local native tribes. Then, in 1620, you have the Pilgrims landing at Plymouth, barely surviving those brutal early winters. And honestly, just a blink later, in 1624, the Dutch famously bought the island of Manhattan for a mere $24, planting the seed for what would become New York City. But all of this rapid expansion, it triggered global imperial wars. The British, French, and Spanish empires were practically carving up the continent, and native tribes were caught directly in the crossfire. To put the human cost into perspective, we're looking at 1.4 million casualties globally from the 7 Years' War, which included the French and Indian War right there in North America. The British ultimately won, pushing the French out, but it fundamentally rewired the map of the world.
Which brings us to Section 2, the road to independence.
So fighting a global wars is incredibly expensive, right? To pay off that literal mountain of debt, Britain decided to heavily tax the colonies, and that set off a rapid-fire chain reaction. In 1765, the Stamp Act suddenly put a tax on practically every single piece of paper. The colonial anger from that completely boiled over in 1770 with the Boston Massacre, where British troops fired into a crowd and killed 5 colonists. Just 3 years later, rebels are dumping 342 crates of British tea into the harbor at the Boston Tea Party. This rapid escalation meant that by 1775, when the infamous shot heard round the world was fired at Lexington and Concord, the rebellion had officially started. Now, the core issue here wasn't actually that the taxes were astronomically high. In fact, many were surprisingly low. The real issue was that the colonists felt their fundamental rights as British subjects were just being completely ignored. They had zero voice in the parliament across the ocean that was suddenly reaching into their wallets. By 1776, what started as a squabble over taxes had morphed into a full-blown revolution for sovereignty. It was justified by Thomas Jefferson's iconic words in the Declaration of Independence, claiming unalienable human rights. But there's a massive paradox here. Writing that all men are created equal while simultaneously expanding the brutal system of chattel slavery in the colonies? That contradiction was basically a ticking time bomb for the nation's future. Let's move on to Section 3, Forging a New Nation. Okay, so General George Washington and the Continental Army miraculously defeat the British, with some very necessary help from the French Navy. But now what? The newly independent states suddenly face the incredibly chaotic reality of actually governing themselves. Seriously, how do you govern 13 fiercely independent states? At first, they tried the Articles of Confederation, but it was just far too weak. After violent uprisings like Shays' Rebellion in 1786, where unpaid war veterans literally occupied courthouses in Massachusetts, it became painfully obvious the system was broken. The federal government couldn't manage the economy or even stop a local revolt. They had to completely rethink everything. Looking at the historical source material, we see 2 completely dueling ideologies emerge at the Constitutional Convention of 1787. On one side, the Federalists are arguing the nation will literally collapse without a strong central authority. On the flip side, the Anti-Federalists are terrified that a strong central government is just going to turn into the exact same British monarchy they just bled to escape. They wanted power firmly in the hands of individual states. The ultimate solution? A massive, unprecedented compromise. They took this new, immense federal power and sliced it into 3 completely distinct branches, with built-in checks and balances to stop any one group from becoming tyrannical. You had the legislative branch making the laws, the executive branch enforcing them, and the judicial branch interpreting them. It was a completely novel framework designed by the people for the people. That takes us to Section 4, manifest destiny, and expansion. With the Constitution locked in, and Washington establishing how the presidency actually works, the U.S. immediately turns its eyes westward. This momentum creates the whole era of manifest destiny, this absolute belief that the country was destined to stretch from the Atlantic to the Pacific. Thomas Jefferson literally doubles the size of the country overnight with the Louisiana Purchase in 1803 and sends Lewis and Clark to figure out what he just bought. Soon, thousands are risking their lives on the grueling Oregon Trail, and the 1848 discovery of gold sparks the massive rush of 49ers to California. The human stories from this era are just wild, like First Lady Dolly Madison, heroically saving George Washington's portrait right before British troops burned down the White House during the War of 1812. But, and this is key, this relentless hunger for land had utterly devastating consequences. It forced the displacement of native tribes through horrors like the Trail of Tears in the 1830s, where roughly 15,000 Native Americans died. That same land hunger also led straight to the Texas Revolution, which gave us the incredibly bloody siege of the Alamo in 1836 and directly ignited the Mexican-American War in 1846. That conflict ultimately handed the U.S. massive chunks of territory, including modern-day California and New Mexico, which perfectly sets the stage for Section 5, A House Divided. As the country expanded west, the fragile peace started fracturing. Adding all this new territory forced the nation into a bitter legislative war over one deeply divisive question. Would these new western states allow slavery? To understand the immense stakes here, just look at this staggering leap. The enslaved population went from roughly 300,000 in the early 1600s, exploding to over 2 million by 1775, and it just kept growing. It really highlights how completely entrenched the brutal institution of slavery was in the American economy, acting as the primary engine for the massively lucrative sugar, tobacco, and cotton trades. Presenting the facts neutrally from our sources, the country had become entirely polarized. Up north, you have an increasingly industrial economy that's leaning toward abolition and firmly committed to keeping the Union together. Conversely, the South is fiercely agrarian, deeply, fundamentally reliant on pro-slavery economics and pushing hard to secede in order to protect what they defined as states' rights. The middle ground? It completely vanished. The dominoes fell incredibly fast at this point. In 1854, the sheer debate over slave states literally sparked a mini civil war out west known as Bleeding Kansas. Then, in 1859, the radical abolitionist John Brown raids Harper's Ferry, hoping to arm a massive slave rebellion. The absolute breaking point hits in 1860. Abraham Lincoln is elected, running on a platform opposing the expansion of slavery, and Southern states immediately begin seceding. By April 1861, Confederate forces are bombarding Fort Sumter in South Carolina, and the Civil War is officially underway. The conflict was catastrophic. General Ulysses S. Grant and General William Tecumseh Sherman prosecuted a brutal, total war strategy that eventually broke the Confederacy's ability to fight, but the cost was unfathomable. 600,000 American lives lost. It's a level of bloodshed that's almost hard to wrap your head around, and it forever scarred both the physical landscape and the psychological soul of the country. And that leads us to our final era, Section 6, the limits of Reconstruction. With the Union finally preserved, and Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation having shifted the entire goal of the war toward abolition, this shattered nation attempted to basically redefine freedom itself. In rapid succession, they passed 3 constitutional amendments trying to permanently secure civil rights for millions of newly freed Black Americans. The 13th Amendment officially abolishes slavery. The 14th grants equal citizenship and protection under the law, and the 15th guarantees the right to vote. And you know what? For a brief, incredible window, backed by federal troops stationed out in the South, real civil rights progress was actually happening. But political compromises completely derailed that momentum. To settle the insanely contested presidential election of 1876, a backroom deal was struck. The Compromise of 1877 gave Rutherford B. Hayes the presidency. But the catch? He had to pull all federal troops out of the South. Without that military protection, those brand new constitutional rights were essentially abandoned. This power vacuum allowed violent white supremacist systems like the KKK to violently take control, launching the deeply oppressive Jim Crow era that would strangle the region for a century. This sudden, tragic halt to civil rights progress leaves us with a really profound question to wrap up this explainer. As the federal government literally walked away from its promises to its own citizens,
how do the unhealed scars of this 400-year timeline continue to ripple through the United States today? It's a powerful reminder that history isn't just something stuck in the past. It is the literal foundation of our present. And this American experiment, it is still very much unfinished. Thanks for joining me on this deep dive. Keep questioning and keep learning.